Yes, so I'm going to be talking about, the topic that I've been given is the true individual, a term that Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of this order, Triratna order and movement, has defined in a way that is quite particular for Triratna. So I'm going to be exploring what he means by the true individual. So a few weeks ago, I live actually with, where are you, Surinaga and others in the community upstairs. And we had film night. We have a kind of home cinema system upstairs. And, well, we did have anyway. We've somehow lost some of the kit. But we had this home cinema system. And we decided to watch Monty Python's Life of Brian. Normally it would be Tarkovsky, or we'd be talking about the Dharma, of course, on a Saturday night. But it was Monty Python's Life of Brian. Who's seen Life of Brian? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it came out. I went to see it when it came out all those years ago. And watching it again all these years later, I thought it was even funnier than I remembered. I think it's really stood the test of time. And you'll remember that Brian is mistaken for the Messiah, for Christ. He's not. He just is a very naughty boy, as it says. He's not the Messiah. And there's this lovely scene, isn't there, where this whole crowd have gathered wanting a teaching from Brian. And they're all gathered outside his house, and he sort of opens the door, which is, it's like a window, it's like a balcony level kind of opening to the house. And they all say, a blessing, a blessing. And he says, no, it's not a blessing. I've got one or two things to say to you. And they all say, tell us both of them. Such a great line. Tell us both. And he says something like, you don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You need to learn to think for yourself. And there's this kind of silence. And then he says, you're all individuals. And they say, yes, we're all individuals. And he says, you're all different. And they say, yes, we're all different, in unison. And then, of course, there's that little lone voice saying, I'm not. And the crowd tell him to shush. And he says to them, he says, you must find your own path. You must, something like that anyway, he says something like, you must find your own way. And they all say, tell us more. Anyway, he kind of gives up. Well, his mother comes and drags him away. But I think that's a very telling little, very, very witty, but also very incisive, little glimpse into how the critique that we act as a herd member, that we follow a herd mentality. That's what the crowd were doing, and that's what they wanted to do. And I guess very often religion has either played into that herd mentality or even encouraged it, exploited it at its worst. You can see that, and then no wonder. Well, certainly when I came along here, I was interested in Buddhism. I really wanted to explore Buddhism. I had a deep intuition, even a deep faith, that Buddhism had something profound to tell me about life. But what I was really wary of was organized religion. I didn't want to be part of an organized religion. So what I would do is I'd come to a class like this. It used to be on a Tuesday night, our equivalent class. And what I'd do is try not to talk to anybody that looked like they were a Buddhist, and hope that they wouldn't talk to me. Certainly order members, I'd sort of avoid studiously, so that they wouldn't get me. And yet, of course, well, they did, didn't they? But, yet, of course, I was fascinated. I kept coming back, if you sort of mean. I wanted to hear what they had to say, but not, they weren't going to sort of get me. Eventually, actually, I went on the winter retreat, the one that Triratna has advertised, albeit 20-something years ago, quite a long time ago, nearly 3 decades ago, actually. I went on this winter retreat. And on that retreat, it was such a powerful, positive experience. I felt so free, so... it felt like... I was going to say so happy, but that feels a trivial word. I felt like I'd found the path of my life, the meaning that my life was going to take. And I'd found some people that were going to help me live that out. I was about 29, maybe, or something like that. And I can remember thinking, I don't care if this is some sort of organised cult. It works. I'm gonna completely throw myself in, and that's what I've done. And I have never, not for a single day, have I regretted that decision in all this time. But what I've discovered is that Triratna differs from that concept of organised religion that I've sort of laid out, perhaps in a rather prejudicial way. It differs from that in its very foundation and its very the very understanding of what Buddhism is differs from that sort of herd mentality, that group mentality, because at the heart of Triratna, Bhante Sangharakshita has placed this notion that you practice the Dharma in order to become more of an individual, not to become more of a group member, a herd member. He calls it a group member. You become more of an individual. There's this kind of sense that the Dharma, Buddhism, doesn't have anything, as it were, to teach us. What it helps us to do is discover our own potential. And when you discover your own potential, when you start to not just discover your own potential, but you start to realize your own potential, you become more, in a way, who you are, because the sort of group instincts, the herd instincts, start to fall away. You become more, in a way, courageous to be who you are. And yet, what you find is that you then want to associate, form friendships with, communicate with others who are becoming more like they are. You have something in common in your individuality. I mean, there's a uniqueness and something deeply unifying that doesn't wipe out that uniqueness. It's a sort of, it touches, I think, on the magic that Pranayamanas was talking about. How can you be completely yourself and yet feel intimately, deeply connected with another? And the order that is at the heart of Triratna is trying to be a community of individuals. I say trying to be because we fall short. If I just speak for myself, I feel I fall short of that ideal of individuality. I still get sucked into group ways of thinking, group ways of behaving. So I think of myself as an aspiring individual, and the order is a network of aspiring individuals who share a deep common conviction that Buddhism, and this particular form of Buddhism, is the way to do that, to become more of an individual. So you find yourself having more and more deeply in common with people who are very, very different to yourself. What happens in the order is that instead of, if it was a cult, what happens, is said to happen in a cult anyway, is that people start to become more and more similar. They talk in the same way, they think in the same way, they act in the same way, they imitate their teacher. That's what a kind of cult. In the order, what happens is that people seem to become more and more different. They seem to become more and more weirdly themselves, even eccentrically themselves. If you know half a dozen order members, you will know half a dozen very weirdly different people who share something deeply that connects them. And I'll try and come on to what that connection is later on, because it actually takes you beyond even this notion of individuality. But I thought in the life of Brian there was something very incisive about it's a satirical look at how we conform to each other. We sort of are constantly trying to look to how do I fit in. Wanting to fit in is such a human need, isn't it? And if we're not careful, we distort who we really are in order to try and fit in. And then you reach middle age or something, you have a crisis, because you think, oh, I've lived a life that I didn't mean to live. I've become the person I didn't mean to become. It isn't really authentic, it's not really me. So I want to explore in this talk a little bit more in detail about what Bhante Sangharakshita means by an individual, particularly what the qualities of an individual are. He sometimes talks in terms of an individual, an individuality, and sometimes he talks in terms of a true individual. He even gives them capital letters, a capital T and a capital I. So I'll come on to that as well. And then maybe I'll try and take us a little bit further into something that seems to go beyond even that true individual, which then starts to talk about Sangha. But I want to start off by talking in sort of more broad and I was going to say visionary terms. I don't mean in a visionary, magical way. I mean in terms of Bhante's vision for what it is to be a human being. He sees human beings as part of an evolutionary process. He says, look, you've got Darwinian evolution or biological evolution that has obviously formed us as a species. Millions of years of evolution, and we've formed as a species. And he says one of the things that seems to differentiate human beings from other animals is our possibly unique. I mean, of course it's a spectrum, so it's not that human beings are. We know this, don't we? That we know that we share quite a lot in common with other animals, particularly other primates. But nevertheless, if you were to sort of say, is there a defining human characteristic that separates us from the other animals? Well, what Bhante talks about is our ability to be self-conscious. So he differentiates between simple consciousness and self-consciousness. So by simple consciousness, what he means is simple consciousness can receive sense input, us through our 5 physical senses, and respond, even react to that. An amoeba will do that, respond to sensory input. So we share that with the whole spectrum of animal life through evolution. We have that ability to respond to sense experience. He calls that simple consciousness. And of course, maybe simple sounds derogatory. It isn't. I mean, it's a miracle, isn't it? We don't know what consciousness it is at all. And Buddhism doesn't define it. Buddhism talks about it, but it won't narrow it down into a definition. It leaves it as a mystery that you have to explore. Here we all are conscious beings. Buddhism says, look at it, explore it. What is your consciousness? But it won't tell you, just like it doesn't teach you theory. It gives you tools so that you can explore. Yeah? But simple consciousness is how he defines this ability to respond to sense experience. He contrasts that with, he says, it's like another step change in evolution when self-consciousness comes along. So do you know how would you define self-consciousness, or how do you think he defines it? What would be the difference between animal consciousness that we also share and a more distinctive human ability?
Knowing how others feel, or being able to maybe perceive how other people are feeling, or how they might feel.
Yeah. Did you hear that? Richie was saying, is it knowing how others feel? I guess imaginatively.
Imaginatively, yeah.
Being able to empathise with others. No. no, I'm teasing. It is. Of course, that's part of it. I think that is part of it. I just like teasing Richie. That's a very good way of talking about it. There's something about our ability to imagine that I think is distinctive. We can imagine. Well, you say how others feel. That's right. We can put ourselves into others' shoes, as it were. We can also imagine ourselves in the future, or we can reflect on ourselves in the past. As far as we know, simple consciousness doesn't do that sort of imaginative reflection or empathizing or so forth. Yeah. So I think that's a very good way. Yes, tell me your name. Dylan, yeah. I won't tease everybody who. You're safe, Dylan.
Simply having the awareness that we're in the process of thinking at any given time.
Yeah, so Dylan is saying simply being aware that we are in the process of thinking. Yeah. So I think this is key. What Bhante talks about, and others have talked about, it's not just Bhante saying these things, is that self-awareness or self-consciousness is awareness that we're aware. Awareness that we're aware. It's awareness, and therefore that others are aware, and therefore this empathy, there's a link there. But there's awareness that we are conscious, consciousness of being conscious. Now, that is like a step change from just having sense input and responding or reacting to sense input. Both your answers taught in that way about us being able to step back from our immediate sense input and reflect on it, or reflect on other people's experience. So what Bhante is saying is that as soon as evolution has given us self-awareness, self-consciousness, this ability to be aware that we're aware, a whole other world opens up for us. Yeah? It's a real step in evolutionary terms. It comes at a price, though, because being aware that we're aware and becoming self-conscious can also be painful. Yeah? Why can it be painful? Yes?
You can become aware of the suffering of others
Yeah.
at a deeper level.
Yeah, you can become aware of the suffering of others at a deeper level, that's right. Yes, I guess even before the internet we wouldn't have been able to be so immediately in contact with the news all around the world, but we are. But yes, if you open yourself up to that sort of imaginative empathy, you become aware of suffering. Yeah. Often we close down, don't we? I'm not able to always stay open to the suffering. I look at the news, I see what's happened in South Korea, I see what's happened in India just in the last few days, and I don't think I've been able to take all of that in at all, actually. I might have started, but I don't think I've got very far yet. But in potential, we could become more aware of suffering. any other reasons why it might be a bit problematic? Yes, Andy.
We become aware of our own mortality as well.
Yeah, that's right. We become aware of our own mortality. So then we can we're faced with existential questions that I believe a giraffe probably doesn't have. Do you know what I mean? Like, we probably, well, maybe they do. Maybe they sort of, stand around talking about when they're going to die and what they should be doing with their lives in the time that they've got. But we certainly have that potential to become aware of our own mortality. So that...
Stories and delusion.
Say that again?
Stories and delusion.
Stories and delusion, yeah, Camelia's saying stories and delusion. So can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? I think I know.
Our ability to think. Sometimes when we close ourselves, instead of staying open, we'll create meaning, and that meaning is not always true.
True. There's fantasy as well, isn't there? So stories and delusions, we can get into creating fantasy worlds for ourselves, deluded fantasy worlds. We can think that actually if I only get the most powerful job, or if I get the most money, or if I get the beautiful partner, or whatever it is, then I'll be living my fulfilled dream life. Actually, that's fantasy. But it's a fantasy that is reinforced by a lot of messages around us in our culture. Yeah, so we can create fantasy worlds that then bring more suffering, addiction even. So yes, there's problems with self-consciousness, but there's also potential with self-consciousness. Because what self-consciousness opens up is the potential to then work on your mind, use your mind to consciously grow your mind, develop your mind. Do you see what I mean? In a way, again, that a simple animal might not be able to do. They might not be able to pause and reflect and say, oh, I wonder if I could become more kind. They probably don't do that, but we can. Now what Bhante says is that awareness of being able to work on our own mind and grow is the next step in this whole evolutionary process. Because as soon as you've got self-consciousness, as soon as you're aware that you're aware, you've got the potential of developing your own consciousness if you want to. And Bhante says that is, he calls it the higher evolution, because it's not then going to be a species level biological genetic thing. I can't work on your mind just as you can't help me develop mine. We can give each other tools and encouragement and so forth, but I can't meditate for you, and you can't meditate for me. Does that make sense? You have to work on your consciousness. The Buddha said he was the shower of the way. He was saying, look, I can't make you liberated. I can't make you enlightened. He couldn't do that. He wasn't, in a way, that sort of magician. He was somebody who had discovered that you can free your own mind from all the fantasies, all the delusions, all the suffering that brings. You can free your own mind, but you have to do the work. But he pointed out that this is the way. He gave us tools, he gave us a map, a path to follow. He discovered that himself, trial and error, and sort of courage and determination. He discovered it, and then he gave us it. And then Buddhism down the generations, in its 2,500 year history, other people have walked that path and given us even more tools. The tool box, as it were, has just grown and grown and grown. We've got now a huge, rich tradition. In fact, many traditions of different types of Buddhism. And Triratna is another addition to that, which is trying to be a new type of Buddhism that draws from all the other types of Buddhism, or is at least open to, drawing on, inspiration from, Eastern traditions and finding ways to apply them in a modern Western context. In a modern context, Western is now sort of pretty much universal in a modern context. So this higher evolution is a potential for us as human beings, but much of the time we don't, well, I speak for myself, I don't want to kind of grow. Yeah, much of the time I want to just watch Life of Brian or the equivalent on YouTube and sort of sink into my simple consciousness and surround myself with pleasant sense experience. Do you recognise that? Yeah? And just be a giraffe munching on some juicy leaves. That's what I want to do a lot of the time. But I know that I've got the potential to do more than that with my mind. Yeah, I have got the potential to grow. So Bhante says that humanity is something to be achieved. It's not something that once you've got a human body, you can assume that you're really a human. Because if you don't use this self-awareness, and he says that a lot of people don't, then in a way you're no different to the animal consciousnesses of other animals. Do you know what I mean? So he's saying humanity it's not a physical body, it's a state of mind, and it's yet to be, for many people, achieved. It's quite a high bar even to be self-aware most of the time. Yeah. So so that's a sort of macro background to, and it places this, what it does is it places the Buddhist path in a whole larger context of life and its evolution. What it does is it says, look, growing as using something like the Dharma, or using the Dharma, not something like the Dharma, to grow your own potential as a conscious human being is part of this whole evolutionary journey. In a way, it's the natural next step for us, having got this ability to be self-aware. So having said all of that sort of more sort of broad telescopic view, I want to explore I want to ask you to explore, what do you think that growth results in? What sort of qualities would a true individual, to use those words, have? What do you think somebody who isn't just lost in herd instinct, group behaviour, but is trying to grow as a human being to become the best that they can be? What sort of qualities?
Epistemic humility.
Humility, epistemic humility.
Yeah, not believing that you've got all the answers.
Yes.
Doubt.
Tell me your name.
Sorry, it's Martin.
Martin. So Martin is saying humility, not believing that you've got all the answers. Doubt. Well, the Buddha certainly, I think, would have said he didn't have all the answers. He said that what he'd woken up to was beyond words, and he couldn't. He tried to give us some words that were pointers, but he was saying it's actually beyond reason, and it's beyond any way of conceiving. And although he, according at least to the Buddhist tradition, he was the first enlightened person, although he sort of acknowledged that yes, he had reached human potential, the heights of human potential, by liberating his mind, he said that he revered the Dharma. He looked up to, in all humility, to the truth. He said that he needed to look up, to reverence, to revere something higher than himself. And that was the truth, reality embodied. So humility is one of those. I think I think you have to be wary of gurus who, particularly in Eastern traditions where you've got gurus, you have to be wary of somebody who says they've got all the answers. Because if they are saying that, and if you don't detect a sense of real groundedness, a sense of humility, then probably I'd say avoid them. Yeah? So humility, I think, is a hallmark of an individual, because look, we're alive on a spinning ball of rock, aren't we? And molten rock at that, spinning pretty fast, and then whizzing round a giant ball of gas that's exploding in a solar system that is, we haven't really even fully explored, in a galaxy of maybe 100 billion such stars, in a universe that could be infinite. We don't know. And I studied physics when I was at university, and physicists don't have a clue as to what's going on. I mean, they have more of a clue than most of us. I'm not saying that, but the more you learn about physics, the more the mystery deepens. Yeah. So humility in the face of this, of life. Any other qualities? Oh, we've got lots of hands. So let's take you first.
Cohesiveness and alignment.
Ah, yes. What do you mean by cohesiveness, alignment? I think I know, and I think you're on the right track.
I suppose it's the opposite of reactiveness.
Right.
And, given the same situation many times over,
Yes.
with less self-alignment, you may be angry, you may be sad,
Yeah.
you may react one way or another.
Yeah.
With more a cohesive,
Yeah.
independent, developed self, you, I suppose, act in the right way.
Yeah. Tell me your name.
Adam.
Adam. I will forget all your names as soon as you told me them, but I'd kind of like to know. So yeah, Adam is saying cohesiveness, this sort of consistency, would you say?
Yeah.
That you are, as it were, an individual, one person. Bhante uses the term integration. He says that an individual is an integrated person, somebody who is knows their own mind and isn't just going to react in different ways unpredictably. Well, maybe they'll be unpredictable, but they won't. It's like they're not split into many different subpersonalities. He says that for many people, for most of us actually, when we start to learn to meditate, we find how split our mind is. Have you found this? That you want to meditate, part of you wants to meditate, part of you wants to lie in bed, part of you wants to, well, I don't know, go for a run or have a bag of chips, or, we're split in contradictory ways, and that's just, they're relatively innocent ways of being split. You can imagine much worse ways of being split. He says that most people, when they learn to meditate, find that they are not just one individual mind. That he says actually they're a loose collection of cells tied together with a name and an address. So as we learn to meditate and grow, we become one more integrated whole. We become a whole human being. Sure, we have different aspects of ourselves, but they're unified. They talk to each other. They're aware of each other. And also you said that we're not so reactive. I think an integrated person can choose how they want to be.
Yeah.
They can choose. In fact, that sense of choice is the thing that Buddhism really talks about as the hallmark of an aware, integrated person. That they are not, their responses in the world, their behaviour is not just governed by their sense input. They can choose. So somebody, to a real individual, like to a Buddha, to the true individual in this tradition, somebody could be really rude, somebody could try and even kill him, and they did, and he wouldn't necessarily react with aversion, with hatred, with anger. Yeah? it's this incredible faculty that human beings can develop, this self-awareness allows you to develop, is an ability to have a gap between the stimulus and the response. And in that gap lies our freedom. I'm just going to read you what Viktor Frankl, you know Viktor Frankl, who was this psychiatrist. He developed a whole new type of psychotherapy. He survived Auschwitz. And anyway, let me just read you. He's such an inspirational figure. He, if you're interested, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which was this sort of seminal book. He wrote other things. But we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken away from a man but one thing. But one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So that puts it very poignantly and very dramatically that he saw some individuals not just react to the most hellish, unimaginably horrible circumstances, but to choose to do something that went against animal instinct. Yeah, to give away your last piece of bread, to comfort others. It's heroic. And if you think about all the great stories that we like to read about or watch, you know, all the heroic stories, they're individuals. They're trying. Why are we so attracted to? Why do so many people want to watch or read Lord of the Rings or the Marvel films or so forth? They're heroic. They're true individuals being pointed to, often in a rather clunky way. But do you see, there's something in us that responds to this heroic impulse where we're not just going to behave in that animal instinctive way, we're going to choose. And we're going to choose something more noble. And that's part of what Buddhism is trying to teach us to do. Any other I saw some hands and I don't think you've all said. Yes, John.
Somebody who embodies the 6 perfections.
The 6 perfections. So that's very dharmic in it. The 6 perfections is a particular dharmic list. Can you remember them? Can you tell us them?
Generosity.
Yes.
Morality.
Yes.
Patient forbearance. Higher consciousness.
Yes. So you've got 4 of them. So there's generosity as the first one. That's important, isn't it? And generosity in this, potentially even in this heroic way. And then there's morality or ethics, which is, again, based on not reacting to stimulus instinctively, necessarily, but trying to respond with kindness, with metta. There's patience in the face of dukkha, in the face of suffering. Life will give us dukkha. If it hasn't already done that to you, I'm afraid it will. It will be giving us some challenges. Maybe that's what we're here to do, is to learn to grow through challenges. Maybe. I mean, maybe that's a fanciful way of thinking, but I prefer that sort of myth, because when I've had challenges in my life, I need positive stories that say, okay, can I reframe this as a challenge that I need to rise above? Yeah. Patience is part of that. It's a heroic virtue, actually, patience. It's not passivity. It's heroic. Energy is another perfection. Virya. So Bhante talks about a true individual would have free-flowing energy. They wouldn't be blocked. They wouldn't be alienated. They wouldn't be repressed. They wouldn't have issues, that have dealt with all their psychological stuff. and released the energy that's locked up in those psychological blockages that we all might have. And then there's awareness. There's samadhi, which is meditation. In this perfection, a true individual, wouldn't be like when we sit down to meditate, and as Suryanada was saying, our minds go off everywhere and we fill the space. A true individual, a Buddha, would just sit down and they'd just rise up into superconscious states. The mind would just open up limitlessly. You'd be in an infinite positive space filled with love and bliss and joy and fulfillment. That's what a Buddha would experience just by sitting still. And then wisdom, and maybe I'll come on to wisdom. So the perfections, Buddhism gives us a list of qualities that we're aspiring to. It gives us lots of lists. But maybe that's kind of, I want to move on in terms of time. Maybe that's enough. Let's just see if there are any other particular qualities. Yeah, one of the ones that Bhante talks about is that a true individual wouldn't be psychologically dependent upon others. Psychologically dependent upon others. Note that he's not saying that you're not dependent on others at all, because we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, house us. We wouldn't be able to live unless you were an extraordinary kind of hermit that was completely self-sufficient. Most of us wouldn't be able to live without dependence on others. Of course we're interconnected beings. But he says psychologically dependent. You wouldn't be psychologically dependent. Isn't that interesting when I think that's a real challenge. Because if you're psychologically not dependent, you really don't mind if people approve of you or disapprove of you. If they praise you or they blame you. Your equanimity is not shaken by other people's opinions. That's quite a tall order. How much of the time do we sort of not walk into a room and try and fit in, or try and, in any situation, gain approval? Yeah. How often is a romantic relationship actually just a codependent situation? How often does that happen? Pretty often. Yeah, not always, but pretty often. So imagine the freedom that would come if you were psychologically not dependent upon others. And yet, a true individual wouldn't be sort of sealed off. They would be imaginatively engaging with others, with love, with metta, but not dependent on them. Yeah. One of the consequences of that is that they would be willing to be alone, stand alone, actually physically alone, if they need to be, but emotionally alone, if they need to be. I think Andy talked about awareness of our own mortality. If you, in Buddhism, you're really encouraged to dwell on death, not in a pessimistic, depressive way, but in a way that is realistic and with a positive, metaphysical heart. We don't teach outside the order. We tend not to teach direct meditative practices which help you reflect on death, because somebody that does that without the robustness and positivity and necessary integration, it can lead to a depressive state. The Buddha made this mistake of teaching people some death contemplations, and came back to see sometime later how they were getting on, some monks, and found that they'd all committed suicide. So he made that mistake as well. He did make mistakes in that way. So in Triratna, what we wait for is somebody to be sufficiently integrated, sufficiently committed and positive before we commit to teaching them actual meditations which help you reflect on death, on your own mortality. So we kind of reserve that for the order, for order members. But if you're interested, well, you can ask for ordination. But so I've done some reflecting on my own death. I've tried to do that. I don't know how I'll be when I come to actually face my death. What it has helped me to do is better cope with bereavement. When my mother died, I was able to cope with that in a way that I found some reserves that I didn't know I had, and was able to respond appropriately, and in a way wish her well, rather than just focus on my loss. And I think that was because I'd done a lot of reflection on death and on our own mortality and what that means for our life. That's what you're trying to do as a Buddhist. So why am I saying that? Because when you are alone, there's a certain sort of parallel with death, particularly if you go on a solitary retreat. If you go on a solitary retreat, who's done a solitary retreat here? Yeah. So a few of you. I think you come up against those sort of existential things. There's nobody there to try and please or to try and. It's a great thing to do. So if you're interested, talk to, and you haven't done one before, talk to somebody that looks like they have, and see if you can do one. I a few years ago did a long solitary retreat. I was away for 6 months on my own, and it was I was trying to reflect on death, and I think it was the closest that I've got in this life to really imaginatively feeling like I could have died. I sort of tried to imaginatively die to my old life. 6 months was long enough to feel that I'd left my old self behind, and it was very, very blissfully free. I mean, blissfully free. I've never felt so alive as I did.
What happened when you got back?
Well, lots of things actually. The very next thing that happened was that Bante died the day after I got back, and so I was left with my teacher having died, and I felt thrust into a world of magic. Actually, it was a magical time when he died, because the other thing that I should say is that from a dharmic perspective, death isn't the end. Death is actually the death of the body. Consciousness then becomes whatever it is when it's not bound by the physical body. And if you've been practicing meditation, and certainly Bante Sangharakshita had been practicing for 8 decades or more, your consciousness, he was definitely ready to expand into that infinite space, and when that happened, and if a consciousness as powerful as his does that, you feel it. I mean, you feel it all around you. It was magical. Anyway, I won't say more about what happened to me when I came back. I'm still here though. So how am I doing for time? Okay, so I'm going to move on. There's one thing that so we've got there are more qualities that you could list. We've talked about quite a lot of qualities, but I think you've got the idea that this individual stands for an ideal human being, and Buddhism is trying to say, look, you can do this in a very practicable way. It's not just the Marvel heroes and comic books that have individuals. We can become more individual, at least. We might not all become Buddhas in this lifetime, but we can move towards that, and that's worth doing. Yeah, that's worth doing. That is our human birthright, and if we don't do that, I think anything else that we do, everything else that we do, because of course we'll probably, have to work, and we'll have relationships, and hopefully, and so forth. But anything else that we do will, if we haven't developed our self-awareness, self-consciousness, do you see we're just living at that more animal level? Does that make sense? Even if we're good animals like giraffes. Einstein once said that he had never had ordinary ambitions. I'm paraphrasing now. He said that, ordinary, he was being a bit derogatory, ordinary ambitions of just comfort and happiness for oneself had never felt enough in his life. He said that such ambitions as comfort and self sort of happiness, that simple self-consciousness in these terms, he says that they were comparable to the ambitions of a pig, to live like that. So that's quite rude, isn't it? He could get away with it. Giraffes are less rude. But the point is the same, isn't it? It's the same. Are we going to actually try and live humanly to our human potential, or are we just going to be content with simple sense experience, trying to get as much of that as pleasurable and comfortable as we can, which a pig does? Yeah, every animal would want. So if we don't do that, I believe that actually there will be part of us gnawing away saying, I haven't lived my life as fully as I wanted to. And I do think that that will come back to haunt us, perhaps on our deathbed, perhaps earlier. It would haunt me. It would haunt me if I felt that I hadn't tried to live my potential. So finally, I want to just touch on something that transcends this self-awareness. We've talked about simple consciousness, self-consciousness, and then what Bhante says is that there's another level again, and he calls this transcendental consciousness. So what he's saying is that you can transcend even this true individual in a sense, or at least in the sense that we've been talking about individual. You can develop, through practicing the Dharma, a type of consciousness that no longer experiences the world as rigidly split between self and other. That no longer has this sense of me as a fixed, separate entity in a world that's out there full of other fixed, separate entities and stuff. You start to, in this new type of consciousness, break through that delusion. It dissolves, and what it's said that you experience is a kind of universal consciousness. You realize that you're a node in something vast, that you're like a crystallization of consciousness in a sea of consciousness. You're just one little cluster in a vast sea of consciousness with other clusters that are, as it were, of the same stuff as you. And what's more, you realize your complete interdependence, that there's no real sense in which there's separateness. And that is said to then release a huge amount of energy, and it's said to release love. It's said to release freedom. It's said to release all the qualities of fulfillment, peace, joy that we have always been looking for, and most of the time we look for in ice cream. And lo and behold, we don't find it. All of that is released with this transcendent consciousness. So that is our true potential. That's what a true individual with a capital T and a capital I is pointing to. It's pointing to enlightenment. It's pointing to Buddhahood. But even that's not the end, because what Bhante Sangharakshita has conceived in this Sangha, in this order, in this movement, is he wants many enlightened beings to be in relation with each other, in communication with each other, in deep harmony with each other, and to allow a force for good to come through them. That's what he sees the order as potentially being, is a network of individuals who are unified in a way, united in a deep way while remaining individuals, so that a transcendental force for good in the world comes through them, that they become transparent to that, so that they can help other beings, so that they can help other beings raise their level of consciousness. Now, Pranyamanis was talking about, I will stop soon, but Pranyamanis was talking about the state of the world. I think that, of course, there's no one simple answer. It's not that if everybody became a Buddhist, you know, we'd still have hunger, and I'm sure there'd still be, well, there'd be death, and it's not that everything just kind of would magic it, all the problems wouldn't be magicked away. But I do believe that the sorts of problems that human beings are now facing, the planetary problems, I mean the environment, but I don't just mean the environment. I mean all sorts of, well, even the notion of economic growth, that we'll just carry on getting wealthier, you know, and all this fuss in this country about are we going to grow economically or not. And at the same time, there's going to be a climate summit. Do you know what I mean? How silly and contradictory are those kind of two ambitions? These problems are not going to be solved at their own level. There needs to be socio-economic, political solutions. I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be, but I think what there also needs to be, and more fundamentally needs to be, is another level of consciousness in humanity. We as a species need to rise to another level of consciousness if we're going to survive, if we're going to thrive, if we're going to fulfill our potential. So that's what Triratna, I believe that's what Bhante was here to do. He was trying to raise consciousness, the consciousness of human beings, as much as he could. And it's a sort of impossible task, a magnificent, impossible, quixotic task. But that was what he meant when he conceived this order and movement. And that's the challenge that he's given me and all the order members, and maybe you feel part of that challenge. And even though we're like we've hardly taken even a baby step in that direction, I don't see what else there is to do. Yeah, to try and do anything else with one's life without bearing in mind our potential for self-consciousness, transcendental consciousness, and the ability to reach out and to help other people also realize that. Without that, nothing else really matters. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry, I've run out of time. We've run out of time.
All right, that's fine.
You can ask me later.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Jnanavaca.
You're
just
very
to
welcome.
say, we'll be carrying on the series of this, what is the Sangha, so exploring more and more of this over the next few weeks leading up until Christmas. Yeah. And thanks again.
You're welcome. And come on the winter retreat.
Yeah.